Okay, we are live. This is the first podcast of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm your host, Todd Lewis, the primary contributor to Praise of Folly, and here with me is my invaluable contributor and tech support, Brock Bellery. Why don't you say hi, Brock?
How y'all doing tonight?
So tonight, our discussion will be about the alternative right. We'll break it up into three broad sections. The history of the alt-right's schisms and fissions, a little bit of discussion about traditional youth network, and maybe a little bit about my run-ins with Matt Parrott, and a little bit of a discussion about NeoReaction. So I think we'll start off with a discussion of the schisms of the alternative right. Now, Brock, you just sent me a link a couple years old to the Daily Stormer about all the drama that's been going on the alternative right. Now, I haven't finished the article, so why don't you give a brief summary of what you read?
Well, Todd, it's actually quite interesting because as I was doing research on the alternative right or the new right, SPLC actually had an interesting article. And I know a lot of people who would associate with the new right would say, well, there you go. But that's just the problem, because the actual article on the SPLC was from the Daily Stormer. And you can basically go there where it discusses sort of the crack up within the new right. And the title of the article is The Infinite Drama Quest. Quote, the battle.
Well, you know, a broken clock is right twice a day.
Well, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I mean, just because it's the SPLC doesn't mean they can't point to something relevant. And what is
think of the NPI breakup and Scott Terry. The SPLC made that public.
Absolutely. It was covering it in a genuine and honest way, because that's how it happened. And whether they like it or not, that's exactly what happened. There was a clear and obvious schism between the likes of the National Policy Institute and Scott Terry.
Exactly. Why don't you explain a little bit the content of the Daily Stormer article?
Well, the Daily Stormer article, it's actually quite amusing, and I encourage anybody listening to actually look it up, because these are the people on the new right covering the personality wars within the new right. So this isn't somebody with an interest in fanning the fires of division. So the title of the article was Infinite Drama Quest, the battle for the soul of the American white nationalism continues. And basically, as a cast of characters, which it describes, various figures within the new right, a sort of character within the Dragon Ball Z universe. And I'll leave the listener to actually check that out, because it's quite humorous, because it involves the likes of Alex Linder, Chechar, Matt Parrott, Matthew Heimbach, Richard Spencer, Colin Liddell, Jared Taylor, the whole crew, even Greg Johnson and Carolyn Yeager. So it covers basically a chaotic moment within the new right history. And one of the interesting parts was I don't know if anybody's heard of Robert Ransdell. He was running back in 2014, he was running for the Kentucky State Senate. And his sort of campaign slogan was, "With Jews, you lose." Well, what happened was, and I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with Ramsey Paul, and of course, who accused Robert Ransdell of being a Jew and a secret agent, which is just fantastic.
It really is.
I mean, it's just pretty over the top.
It kind of reminds me of Stalin when he said that all of Lenin's associates were actually capitalist agents.
Right. And that's what you actually see a lot of among white nationalists, is the accusation that you're a cohort for the SPLC or working as a secret agent on behalf of the FBI.
Well, in fact, recently, didn't Greg Johnson accuse Matt Parrott and Matt Heimbach of working for the SPLC?
Oh, yeah, because Matt Parrott and Matt Heimbach did an interview with the SPLC. So obviously they're working for the SPLC, which, you know, it was a pretty low blow from
Yeah, it was.
Wisconsin. It was pretty low, and you know, that's going to become more and more common because there's no real glue to the New Right movement. And if anything, this Daily Stormer article explains is that this is a personality war among people that can't even agree on basic principles. And I really think this has something fundamentally. It has to do fundamentally with the ideology, the metaphysical underpinnings of what constitutes the North American New Right.
I think you're correct. And I'll just say this. Well, not quite a year ago, I wrote an article for Traditional Youth Network called traditionalright.com.
Yeah, not trad youth.
a critical evaluation of the New Right. And that created a whole S-storm all in and of itself. Mm. But this was right around the time of the Rini-Owen breakup and the Roosh v. Krauser affair. I'll explain those briefly. Roosh v. is a member of the MRA, is the Manosphere. He's one of the leading Manosphere advocates and is a PUA, which is a shorthand for pickup artist. And on his blog, he got into a big fight with a guy named Krauser, who started arguing for some white nationalist positions. And Roosh v. is of course, Persian, Armenian, and one of his moderators was, I think, an Egyptian. And they got really upset, and that created a whole kerfuffle. And then Davis Aruni and Jordan Owen created this really questionable quality documentary called The Sarkeesian Effect, which is about how social justice warriors are ruining video games. And there's this whole big breakup that I can't help but feel was somewhat scripted because they got back together very quickly. And that was kind of the precedent for this article. And I criticized the divisions within the movement, predicting that it wouldn't do very well. And in fact, I'd been saying such things even before the article.
That's right.
And it turns out everything that I've said is coming true. Now, one of the things that Matthew Parrott has accused me of doing is driving a wedge between the movement. Mm-hmm. But the wedges, the schisms are already there. They've been happening before I even showed up. To accuse me, by pointing out a schism and accusing me of driving a wedge, makes about as much sense as a stormtrooper telling Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker is flying into the heart of the Death Star, and accusing the stormtrooper of Luke Skywalker flying into the Death Star to blow it up. It's not the stormtrooper's fault. He's just reporting the facts that Luke Skywalker is about to blow up the Death Star.
Exactly. They're engaging in an act of shooting the messenger.
Well, exactly. I think we should explain, for whatever audience we might have, a little bit of what the alt-right is. The alt-right is generally, there's this really nice map of the alt-right, if you've ever looked it up. It's divided into various segments, but broadly speaking, there's three large groups. There's the Manosphere, led by people like Roosh v. And then there's the NeoReaction, formerly led by Mencius Moldbug. And the flagship website now seems to be Social Matters. And then there's the general white nationalist movement, led by groups like Traditional Youth Network, Countercurrents, Radix Journal. Now, I know a little bit more about the white nationalist element than I do about the other two. And in the white nationalist-ish movement, there's essentially three positions that I've noticed. There's the Jew first. It's always the Jews. It's like the eternal Jew. That's one element to the alternative right. You can see that on the Daily Stormer. And even to some extent, you can see it on Countercurrents. And then you have a more somewhat moderate position, but still blaming the Jews on Traditional Youth Network. It tries to synthesize Christianity with some form of white nationalism or national socialism. You can look at Matt Parrott's collaboration with Eric Stryker, who identifies as a neo-Nazi. And then you have the moderate white nationalists led by Colin Liddell and Andy Nowicki, who run AltRight.blogspot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems that these are the three groups. Now, granted, there's further subdivisions in the Manosphere, and there's further subdivisions on the NeoReaction, but I'm not very in-depth on those. But needless to say, there's been innumerable schisms. Quite recently, there was a big blow-up about a month or two ago between the white nationalists and Roosh V, because Roosh V boasted of getting laid by white women, and they could not. And there was a prominent article written by Greg Johnson criticizing Roosh V for his philandering. But that's somewhat questionable because Greg Johnson's own sexual preferences are questionable as well. And it's also the case that quite recently, I think it was called the Gay Panic Button, was an article written on Countercurrents accusing Matt Parrott and Matt Heinbach of, quote, essentially, charlatanry and just, trying to divide the movement by making themselves look big. And then Matt Parrott wrote a response called, "We're here, we're not queer, deal with it," or something like that. And it's quite interesting that Greg Johnson would accuse Matt Parrott of working with the FPLC, which is patently absurd. And it all goes back to an article written by Scott Terry on Shotgun Walled at Heart, describing his speculations about why Matt Heinbach was disinvited from NPI of 2015. And he argued that it was because of their views on homosexuality and that Richard Spencer was a closeted homosexual. But then the SPLC picked up on it and it went viral. And, again and again, more divisions, more disputes. It really sounds like a style. It's like Stalinism, but without the central authority. It's like all these, oh, you're a spy, you're an infiltrator, but there's no central authority to kill them.
Right, exactly. I guess, as I studied, the whole affair, and I brought it up just a little bit ago. There's nothing really that the NeoReaction sort of North American New Right and the Manosphere have in common that much. They don't share any deep underpinning philosophy other than let's go back. But and that's about the closest thing that unites them, is that they want to go back to some way of living some time ago. In other words, sometime in the past.
Well, I don't even think that's correct. I think what unites them is hatred of the left. And in many ways, we can kind of see the ridiculous. For instance, Matthew Parrott, I think it was a year or two ago, wrote an article about Roosh V's neo-masculinity. And he argued that Roosh V had turned a new leaf. He was a new man. He had stopped being a PUA and wanted to own up to being a man. Well, Matt Parrott had to eat his own words about a month or two later when Roosh V bragged about getting more white women than the white nationalists do. So clearly Matt Parrott is not a very good judge of who's a friend and who's not. And for the long time, he was a friend with Greg Johnson until the Gay Panic Button article, where Greg Johnson accused him of working for the SPLC. So clearly Matthew Parrott is not a man of very sound or sober judgment.
No, I agree. But let me nuance my position. When I say they want to go back to some sort of, time in the past, that's the biggest generality I can say, because they don't agree on what they're going back to. And their hatred of the left is really just two sides to the same coin. The hatred of the left and the desire to go back. It's because the left for them represents a sort of a vernacular modernity, whereas the neo-reaction or the dark enlightenment, they want to go back to, pre-Protestant Reformation. Or if you go the alt-right, they want to go back to sort of a hallowed time before the Socratics entered the scene. They want to go back to the pre-Socratic way of living. Or if you have the manosphere, well, it's not entirely sure. They just want to go back to some time where, the man was the leader of his household, or the man had primacy within society. So they all want to kind of go back to something, pre-modernity. They can't really agree on what that entails. And none of them are actually compatible with one another in a lot of different ways. And so what unites them is this desire to, in other words, negate modernity, which they associate with the left.
Yeah. Yeah, what was that popular sitcom about corporate America in the 1960s?
The sitcom about corporate America.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. You know, the advertising. The guy was an advertiser, a womanizer, and a philanderer.
That doesn't ring a bell.
No, I guess I'll just drop it. I can't
But
seem to think of it.
I
But
couldn't think of it. Yeah, I never saw it.
yeah, but that's kind of what the manosphere wants to go back to. But
Exactly, exactly. It's just where, in other words, for the manosphere, it's pure sexual angst, and in other words, feminism is really their target.
yeah, well, yeah,
It,
yeah.
which
They
of
tend
course
to,
they associate with the modern left.
which is not entirely false.
Right.
I would say I think we've dealt with the divisions pretty well and the general distinctions and the general ego wars within the alternative right. It's pretty much a dead letter until they, you know, there's a saying, don't eat the right, but nobody seems to believe in it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, like I said, it's because it's a personality war. You know, and usually you see these personality wars arise in ideologies because the ideologies themselves are bankrupt. In other words, they tend to revolve around particular individuals, and then of course then you have the beta orbiters, you know, who cluster around those individuals, and of course, you know, stump for them and defend them, you know, no matter what the cost, or even, and heck, even if the guy they represent is completely wrong.
That's true. In a lot of ways, again, they're not even really as competent as the left, because during the Spanish Civil War there was a movement called the it was basically an umbrella organization called the Popular Front, where liberals, Democrats, Marxists, anarchists all grouped together to fight the boogeyman of the right. And it's
Exactly.
funny, and they actually, now they failed because Franco built a better coalition. He
Right.
built a coalition out of Carlists, fascists, Catholic Social Democrats, and the rest.
Mm-hmm.
And that was more stable than the leftist. But see, they both knew they needed a coalition, and they agreed on a core value and ignored their differences until they'd already won.
Because they were under real duress. You see, the new right in the United States likes to pretend it's being severely persecuted when it really isn't. And so they have way too much time on their hands to fight one another than to actually fight their supposed real enemy, the left, because they're not really engaging them. I mean, the best they did, remember, for them in 2015's current year, quote unquote, was to create the word cuckservative. And that was their triumph. That was it.
Oh yeah, I remember this big hangout with like Greg Johnson and Richard Spencer, and they said, "Yeah, 2015 is our year because of Donald Trump and conservative." Well, newsflash: Donald Trump is not your guy. He's a Jew lover, and you hate Jews. So you apparently hate Jews. So
exactly.
Donald Trump's own daughter is a Jew. Okay,
well, I mean, did anyone listen to his speech at APAC? I mean, where he was talking.
Hilarious.
Oh yeah, and you know, anybody, you know, and the alt-right like is falling over themselves to endorse this man, you know, who is strongly and fervently committed to the state of Israel and hence to Zionism, which, you know, should be, you know, anathema to people on the new right.
Yeah, exactly. But let's move over a little bit to Traditional Youth Network, because I've had a few runs in with them. I've written a few articles attacking Matt Parrott. First article was during the Bill Nye and Ken Ham debate, where basically Matt Parrott, being the typical white nationalist, attacked his Christian allies for not being white nationalists enough, but did not attack his white nationalist allies for being not Christian enough. But, you know, it's pretty clear he's a white nationalist entryist into Orthodox Christianity, because he never actually accuses white nationalists of not being Christian enough. And then I read another article a few months ago attacking him for being collaborating with neo-Nazis and pagans and general undesirables, Basic Bible verses like do not be gathered in the assembly of the wicked. I mean, I think David's pretty clear on that. You shouldn't really be collaborating with these people. Israel was destroyed for seeking alliances with Egypt. God said, trust me, not the pagan nations.
That's right.
And then my latest article was an attack on Orthodox tribalism, a kind of fairy tale that Matt Parrott tells himself before he goes to bed. Because apparently he doesn't realize the Orthodox Christianity is an ecumenical, global, misogynistic empire.
Well, absolutely. That thousands of years of Orthodox tribalism that's just straight up hot garbage. The history of the Orthodox Church is basically screaming that they are not opposed in any way, shape, or form to racial intermixing, and in fact, phyllotism is condemned by the Orthodox Church. And you mentioned just a little bit ago Matt Parrott's tendency to aside with his pagan cohorts over his fellow Christian, especially whenever he attacked the Christian creationist Ken Ham, and sided de facto with Bill Nye. Well, this seems to be a typical move for Matt Parrott and people he hangs out with, even the likes of Scott Terry, because remember, and in fact, you can actually go to the article on Countercurrents. The article is Gay Panic on the Alt-Right. What does Scott Terry say to Greg Johnson? And actually, I have it right here. He said, I, Scott Terry, am the one who speculated about the reasons NPI banned Heimbach from their conference. And I'm also the one with the OT, or Old Testament, ethical views. The SPLC got their coverage from the blog I wrote about the issue. To say the Mats, quote, made up the story in an effort to smear the NPI and initiate some massive troll is patently false. If anything, this is the important part right here, they bent over backwards to be accommodating and promote unity among our ilk. Anyone who knows them knows that. Right there.
Exactly. That is so true.
They have bent over backwards for these people who hate them, and they have basically shunned those who they ought to side with, their Christian brothers.
Well, that's exactly what I pointed out, and I was accused of driving a wedge. So I guess if I told Matt Parrott his house was on fire, I caused the fire, right?
Right, exactly. Because they're losing their cool right now. Because you're pointing out something that, whether or not they know it, and I'm starting to think they do know it, their house is on fire. And
well, they do know it. In the comment to my second attack on Matt Parrott on Traditional Youth Network, his response, he admitted to the Swiss chemist that he was being drubbed out of the alternative right. And in fact, in his response to Greg Johnson, he admits the same thing too. Yep. So apparently they don't like him. And given the speculation about Matt Heimbach's orthodoxy and excommunication and all that, apparently whatever the truth is, the Orthodox Church is not terribly keen of him either. So both sides hate him, and he's just trying to please both of them. I mean, compromise doesn't work. It reminds me of a story. There was during the I think it was the Second Samnite War. The king of the Samnites defeated the Romans in 341 at the Battle of Caudine Forks. He surrounded their army and they surrendered. He asked his father what he should do. His father said, kill them all, therefore Rome will be too weak to retaliate, or win Rome's friendship by releasing them. But the king of the Samnites, being a dumb young man that he was, did neither. He humiliated the Romans and sent them back home, which meant within the next couple of campaigning seasons, they would come back for revenge.
Yep.
And it seems that Matt Parrott has chosen the third position of compromise, which in fact makes nobody happy.
Exactly. And remember he banned the Swiss Kinnist from Traditional Youth Network.
Yes, he did.
I mean, he's trying to,
Would Matt Parrott ever ban a National Socialist or a pagan?
Heck no. I mean, he has Eric Stryker on there, who hates Christians. I mean, I've read plenty of his work, and he has nothing. He has nothing in common with Christians. The only reason Matt has him there is because he's a neo-Nazi.
He's the token neo-Nazi.
Yeah, especially on Trad Youth. He's sort of like, he's sort of one of the remaining few who actually, is friends with Matt Parrott and Matthew Heimbach.
It's kind of like, Pat Buchanan, why are you on MSNBC Hardball? They hate you anyhow. Just leave.
Right. Well, didn't they kick him off of there?
They eventually did after his book Suicide of a Superpower. But
Yeah.
in many ways, I think that Eric Stryker is the Pat Buchanan of traditional youth network.
Right, exactly. Well, I mean, with all the bridges being burnt between the New Right and whatever it is Matt Parrott's project, I mean, it's hard to characterize. It's certainly not biblical. And
well,
I wonder.
apparently Matt Parrott's project is a mix between Starship Troopers, Warhammer 40K, the Orthodox Church, and National Socialism. I'll leave the audience to figure out what that is.
Well, I won't even let them waste their time. It's complete nonsense. It's incoherence.
But exactly. I think the main thing to take away from Matt Parrott is that he's a very classic Marxist. For instance, when the Soviet Union failed to meet a production quota, they blamed it on wreckers. But then they would say they actually superseded the production quota by rewriting the quota after the fact.
Exactly.
So they'd first say the quota was short because of wreckers, and then they'd say later on the quota was superseded beyond their expectation. And in many ways, that's what Matt Parrott does. He controls the narrative. If I point out there's a fire, I cause the fire. I'm not driving any wedges. I mean, I can just sit back and watch and eat popcorn and drink soda, because the wedges are just going to tear them apart anyhow. I'm just pointing out there's a...
Exactly, because that's exactly what's happening. You see, whenever your ideology itself is internally inconsistent, what they ultimately spend their time doing is narrative control, rephrasing every single incident in order to put out these fires. And they're not really putting them out. They're just sort of covering them up, pretending they're not there.
Basically, Matt Parrott is pursuing a policy of CYA.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Cover your ass, because what else has he got left to do?
Well, not much, since the Orthodox Church seems to have excommunicated him. Well, at least Matt Heimbach. And it seems like Greg Johnson seems to hate him. But you know what it probably is? It's probably that Matt Parrott is a Jew file infiltrator from the SPLC. That's what it really is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's obviously not because Matt is incompetent or arrogant. It's because he's clearly a malicious Jew working for the SPLC.
I would actually say of the alt-right, Matt Parrott and Matt Heimbach have been some of the most conciliatory and olive branch extending individuals out there. But the fact is, extending olive branches doesn't matter if they already hate you.
Well, exactly. And that's why, the white nationalists of the atheist variety really aren't that much different than the atheists on the left. They use the exact same language. They use the exact same styles of attacks on Christians. Because, they make the people like, Greg Johnson, make a lot of noise about Jews. But I mean, sometimes I wonder if he doesn't hate Christians more than he hates Jews.
That's a very real possibility. And the kind of fedora atheists that you're thinking of, a lot of the alt-right atheists are that. In fact, on Renegade Broadcasting Radio, there's a segment called The Truth Hurts, and Hurts is spelled Hertz. And it's a kind of fedora Jew hater. Basically, he's a fedora who hates the Bible, but he also hates Jews too.
Exactly.
So he's kind of a fedora Jew hater. And a lot of the neo-Nazi alt-right are just fedora Jew haters.
Right,
and,
yeah. They hate Christianity because they see it as a Jewish religion.
And they have no better arguments than their, Richard Dawkins atheist plus compatriots.
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing. And whether they like to think so or not, it is exactly the same thing. Their ideological battle with the left is, well, their ideological battle with the left, it's like two doppelgangers about ready to duke it out. And
yeah, that's true.
They're not alternatives to one another, really.
Well, we can get into that a little bit later. One of the other things that I wanted to bring up was the NeoReaction. Now, recently I was on a Hangout with reactionary Christians on reactionary Ian. And in it, we discussed the church and state. Now, I won't bore you with the details. You can go to Reactionary Ian's YouTube channel yourself and watch it. But there are two main points. I argued the fact that the church had no role in the state, as we see in the New Testament, and as we see in the pre-Constantinian church. More on that in some later podcast, hopefully. But all I got was pragmatic arguments, which is exactly the kind of argument that the early Christian apologist Origen received from Celsus and is against the Celsus. And in many ways, when your opponents act like pagans and they claim to be Christians, I think it's pretty clear who won the debate. The thing that I think is more pertinent to this discussion is when we shifted from church and state to the origin of the Enlightenment. There's been a certain view popularized by people like Mencius Moldbug and E. Michael Jones and others, traditional Catholics, neo-reactionaries, that the Enlightenment is a uniquely Protestant problem. Protestantism, and in the way the narrative usually goes is, once upon a time in the Middle Ages, we had a church hierarchy with a pope and a bishop and a priest, and everybody knew their place. And then once upon a time, this big, bad, evil Luther said the common man could read the Bible. And at that point, the monopoly of the bishop, the priest, and the pope was broken. And of course, the common man obviously is not capable of understanding the Bible. So therefore, that led to modernism by destroying hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the crude narrative. I mean, E. Michael Jones might be more sophisticated. Mencius Moldbug, I doubt it. I thought he was kind of a poser, more of an intellectual poser to myself.
E. Michael Jones definitely did it better.
No, he was a far more sophisticated critic. And I answered him in an article that I wrote in 2014 on my blog, praiseoffolly.wordpress.com. And you can read that there, where I said, I think it was like, does Protestantism lead to progressivism or something of that nature?
The title of the article, Does Progressivism Grow Out of Protestantism?
Exactly. And last night, when this was going on, we had this discussion, and it was pretty clear that a lot of the people just were in there for the echo chamber effect. They didn't really want an argument. And the main thing was, did Protestantism lead to Catholicism? So before I go, I want you to give your thoughts on that.
On the question of does progressivism grow out of Protestantism, right?
Exactly. I kind of want to have your thoughts first.
Right. And I think you and I talked about before, there's this correlation they make, but it obviously doesn't imply causation. The Protestant Reformation, really takes off in a time that is, contemporary with the Enlightenment. But that correlation is obviously not causation. In fact, Luther never thought he was innovating. In fact, he thought he was just being a good Augustinian monk. And thought he was being a good Catholic. So his goal wasn't to actually create a whole new church. His goal was to reform the Catholic Church. And took Augustine very seriously. I mean, his whole argument was based on that of Augustine, which was the go-to guy for Christian theology in the Latin Church. So he thought he was being perfectly consistent with Catholicism. So if anybody could be blamed for the Enlightenment, it grew from within the church.
Exactly. Both you and I went to Malone University. Mm-hmm. And isn't it true that one of your philosophy classes with Professor Floyd, you had an Orthodox student who argued that there was a kind of inner dialectic within Augustinian theology that would ultimately result in the Reformation?
Exactly, because if I remember correctly, it was Dr. Floyd, who's a Catholic and the philosophy professor that we were in class with. He wanted to fault William of Ockham because of Occam's nominalism, and the nominalism within Occam's work sort of paved the way for a lot of Luther's theological, quote, innovations. A lot more could be said on that, but I don't think that's really the topic of the discussion. But Occam was working, again, strictly within the Augustinian tradition, even the Thomistic tradition as well.
They all were.
They all were. They did not think they were innovating whatsoever. So what this Orthodox student pointed out, I said, well, why stop with Occam? Because Occam, unless you really know what Occam said, you really can't immediately just fault him, because if you actually do read Occam, the arguments proceed rather logically from the premises we acquire from Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. And so this Orthodox student says, well, why stop with Occam? Why not keep going back all the way to Augustine?
Well, that's a very good point, because why not go back to Greek philosophy to begin with, right?
Right, exactly. Because Augustine, he definitely had carried over with him his Manichaeanism and a lot of Neoplatonic philosophy, and he attempted to make a grand synthesis with Christianity. It was sort of grand synthesis between Christianity and Neoplatonic philosophy. Just like, later Thomas Aquinas would try to make that grand synthesis between all three, like Aristotelianism, Neoplatonism, and Christianity. So what this Orthodox student was pointing out is it merges out of Greek philosophies, the attempt of merging Greek philosophy with Christian theology. And so, to get back to our point, does progressivism grow out of Protestantism? Well, yes and no, because to say that Protestantism is its own sort of thing and it had no roots and it was sort of an innovation is really not true. Protestantism has its roots in Catholicism, and Catholicism itself having its roots in Augustine, and Augustine having his roots in the Manichaean tradition and the Neoplatonic tradition. And so when we ask, does progressivism grow out of Protestantism? Well, that's really, falling short of where the emphasis needs to fall. And that is with the attempt to systematize Christian theology with Greek philosophy.
Well, it's interesting. I've had Orthodox Christian friends, and I've known Orthodox Christians, and they'll often say that Western theology first went wrong with Augustine. And in fact, in the 19th century, two of the more, Ephraim the Syrian, Khomiakov, and, I'll just stick with Khomiakov, and Dostoevsky, yes, right. Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, and Khomiakov argued when they had a polemic against the West and humanism, they didn't even mention Protestants.
Nope.
Khomiakov and Dostoevsky knew that it came from the Catholic Church. And the Protestants, as with the secular humanists, much a symptom of Rome. So Protestantism was not the cause. It was a symptom of Rome. Rome was the cause. And in fact, Dostoevsky and Khomiakov, I think, make very compelling arguments that it was actually Rome, not the Protestants, that gave us modernity. And last night in the discussion that I had, there was accusations that, the Protestants did this and that. And I said, well, that's just not true. The Illuminati was founded in Bavaria, and the Illuminati was behind the French Revolution.
Exactly.
So you might see those boxes, those instant food boxes, no preparation necessary. You just nuke it in the microwave and it's ready to go. You can have a box that says French Revolution, no Protestants necessary.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Because as we had discussed before, it was the Rhineland mystics who were Catholics who cooked up these secret occult societies that would ultimately ferment the revolutionary spirit.
Well, exactly. I mean, the idea that you have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ was not a result of evangelical tent meetings.
Right.
It was the result of the Rhineland mystics in the 14th century led by Master Eckhart.
Yep.
Or mystics like Julian of Norwich, who had their personal relationship with God, independent of the church. It was mysticism in the Catholic Church that led to this. And not only that, where did the Renaissance start? Italy, with the likes of Boccaccio and Mirandola. and the rise of Hermeticism, the occult tradition traced back to ancient Egypt. And that did not occur in Protestant countries. It was initiated in Catholic Italy.
Exactly.
And it was Catholic occult scholars, like, again, Mirandola and others, who created modern-day humanism that the NeoReaction so loathes.
Exactly. Because it was within the Catholic countries that we see this revolutionary spirit. And also, even in the Orthodox Russia, we saw that revolutionary spirit. So, I mean, the Orthodox don't escape totally unscathed here.
Well, there's this kind of fairy tale that as long as you have a priesthood and everybody knows their place, and you just shut up and listen to the priests, you won't have liberalism.
Which is complete crap.
But that's crap, because if you look at the ancient regime in France under Louis XVII,
yep,
and the ancient regime in Russia under Tsar Nicholas II, they had exactly the kind of societies that Mencius Moldbug and NeoReaction would advocate, and they had the worst examples of modernity.
Exactly.
But actually last night, there was a certain Catholic who said, well, you're living in the worst example. And I said, wait, are you telling me that the United States is not worse than the Soviet Union?
Oh, my goodness.
No, not really. Because really, Brock, the same time England had Hume and Locke, France had atheists like Voltaire and Rousseau were deists. But they had atheists like the Holbach and Diderot. And the fact is that they had the same crap going on. And it was in France. And then Bavaria had the Illuminati, and Italy had the Hermetic tradition. And another argument is that the kind of dominance of finance is a Protestant idea. Baloney. You have the de Medicis in Venice and Italy. You have the Fuggers in Austria, the Fugger family. And long before there were even Protestants, you already had the financial domination of the Pope in Rome by the de Medicis.
Well, exactly, because where does this idea of financial domination arise? It arises from usury. Well, it was clear usury was clearly prohibited in Scripture, but who was it that said, no, yeah, it's okay to do usury in certain circumstances?
The Spanish scholastics.
The Jesuits. They said,
the Jesuits.
Through casuistry, they said, well, there are certain instances where usury is okay.
And if you doubt us, you can go to Murray Rothbard's History of Economics.
Yep.
Or you can go to the von Mises Institute, where they have plenty of Catholics. The leader's actually a Catholic.
Yep.
So yes, there are the Catholic Church gave us usury, financial domination, the rights of man, and it's not the Protestants' fault. But here's a deeper problem. And beginning in around 1300, with the Babylonian captivity by Louis the Fair, King of France, the papacy had completely failed. Medieval Christendom, by the time of the Babylonian captivity, had completely disintegrated. You had the reforms of the monks of Cluny beginning around 1070 with Urban II, and the Apogee of Papal authority with Innocent XIII. But then there was this precipitous decline due to worldliness and corruption, and the papacy lost its respectability. And then when it became a puppet of the French king for 70 years, culminating in the rule of 3 popes, which led to the Council of Constance, which reinstated the papacy in Italy, the papacy had lost all authority. You'd had the Waldensians in Italy and Switzerland. You had the Lollards in England and the Hussites in Bohemia. And really, the Protestants were not the cause of modernity. They were a symptom of Catholic failure.
Exactly.
The Catholic Church, the Catholic Western Europe was so divided, so weak, that it couldn't even put down the Protestants. They put down the Hussites, they put down the Lollards, but Luther came along and Zwingli and Calvin, and by that point, the groundswell was so great that they couldn't actually put it down. The Catholic Church had already failed by the Babylonian captivity. In fact, the Reformation strengthened the Catholic Church by instigating the Counter-Reformation, which led to much-needed reforms.
Oh, absolutely. And like you said, it was all baked into the whole system anyway. How else did all this really just sort of burst forth at one moment? It was because Luther made some good arguments. So did Calvin. So did Zwingli, all from Catholicism.
Well, exactly. They were Augustinian. They argued from Augustinian tradition.
Right. So the contradictions were already there. What changed? Well, it was the Catholic Church's ability to suppress what it saw as heresy.
But it couldn't. It lost all political power by the time of the Babylonian captivity.
Exactly. The demonstration of the Babylonian captivity proved that the church was impotent against. It was impotent with regards to its power to enforce its interpretation of Augustine. I mean, that's really that's why the Protestant Reformation could even happen to begin with, because these disagreements existed before.
Well, it's interesting. And as an analogy, in the Romans and the Persians had fought for centuries, and the only victor of that war was the Arab Muslims, because when the Persians and the Romans were exhausted, they conquered most of their empires. Well, they actually conquered Persia entirely and most of the Roman Empire. In many ways, the papal disputes with the Holy Roman Emperor went on for centuries, but the real victor was France, because France could step in and control the Pope after the Holy Roman Emperor had been. Now, the other thing here is, what led to modernity? Was it a problem of wrong doctrine? That's partly true. And the wrong doctrine goes back to Rome itself. In fact, Kolniakov even said that the Luther hatched the egg the Pope laid.
Yep.
But the point is this. Why is it that modernity succeeded? Well, I think the main reason why modernity disliked Christianity is if you actually read people like Voltaire and Gibbon and Hume, they point out the hypocrisy of Christendom. Christ teaches love and forgiveness and compassion and apostolic poverty on the one hand. On the other hand, the Catholic Church lives like a prince, murdering people, fornicating, living in wealth and luxury. Arnold of Bresca, I think in the 13th century, and Savonarola in the 16th century condemned Rome for its excess, and then their payment was death. And the fact is, the problem is, we shouldn't leave the critique of Christendom to Voltaire's bastards, as they're often called. The new atheists are often called Voltaire's bastards. The fact is, they have legitimate arguments against the hypocrisy of the church. And in many ways, it was the hypocrisy of the papacy in the 14th century that even led to the Hussites, the Lollards, and Luther. And that hypocrisy was never really destroyed. In fact, if you read Hilary Belloc's, I think it was called, he wrote a book about the 6 heresies of Christendom, of which Protestantism is one of those heresies. And he argues that Protestantism was the cause for the decline of the Catholic Church throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The fact is, the decline of the Catholic Church began with the Babylonian captivity. In fact, if the church had not been in a state of weakness and decline, Luther could never have even revolted.
Exactly.
The decline predates the Reformation, but it's often convenient to blame somebody else, much as Adam blamed Eve and Eve blamed the serpent. It's not my fault, it's their fault. Even though it was your own corruption, weakness, and sycophancy that led to the possibility of Luther in the first place.
Exactly. Luther was just the right man at the right time with the right circumstances, because his ideas weren't exactly new. They just needed the right moment to actually take hold and finally uproot Catholic authority. And that moment came after the Babylonian captivity, because that proved that the Catholic Church could not enforce its own dictums.
Well, not only that, the Orthodox Church wasn't a whole lot better. I don't know this. I don't know the source at the moment, but there was a late 19th century Russian nobleman who was discussing the state of affairs in Russia with an Austrian ambassador, and he said that if it was not against the law to leave the Orthodox Church, half the nobility would become Catholic, and half the peasants would join local religious movements. I mean, clearly, they themselves had already been hollowed out and were ripe for Bolshevism.
Right.
This leads to another point. Within NeoReaction, there's this weird fetish with monarchy. Now, the claim is that monarchy is a more effective form of government than republics or democracy. Now, one common mistake the neo-reactionaries make is they conflate democracy with the republic, which is absolutely absurd. Republic, classically conceived by Cicero, is a mixed government. And referring back to Aristotle's division of the aristocracy, monarchy, aristocracy, and polity as the good forms, and tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy as the bad forms, a republic has an element of all three. And it's a mixed government. So a republic has the benefits of all three while mitigating their deficiencies. And so what I would say is that a republic is not a democracy at all. It's very different, though there might be republics that err on the side of democracy. So that aside, monarchies are not more effective than democracies. The Hellenistic monarchies that replaced Alexander the Great were completely smashed by Rome, the French Republic, the first French Republic, led by, I think it was Carver, one of the foreign policy analysts, foreign policy drivers was a man named Carver. And they were kicking the butts of all the European monarchies. And then, of course, you had the United States, another republic that was just a complete juggernaut. And clearly, republics are, on average, more effective. They have more reliable leadership. They have less centralized authority, at least initially. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, amongst the Christian auxiliary of the alternative, of the NeoReaction, this fetish with monarchy is particularly surprising, given that in the book of 1 Samuel, the monarchy was considered a curse. Mm-hmm. And he tells Samuel to tell the children of Israel that a great deal of curses would fall upon them for choosing a king over him. Now, God would give them the wishes of their heart, but leave them empty in spirit. But in many ways, if you're a Christian, being pro-monarchy is problematic given the passage of 1 Samuel 8. Mm-hmm. And really, the NeoReaction is a kind of a fraud. It's kind of a dead letter. I mean, Mencius Moldbug, as you said, has stopped writing. Very few people read Social Matters or their contributors. It's a very small movement.
Right. Well, to be fair, yeah, we don't have a high readership, but when we're evaluating, this NeoReaction, what we're really interested in is its stunning decline. I mean, it was really a flash in the pan. Mencius Moldbug, a computer programmer by day and by night, a neo-reactionary. He just totally faded from the scene. And I think it has to do with, first of all, modern Catholicism is not hospitable to the likes of Mencius Moldbug, to the likes of these dark Enlightenment figures who want to restore, a pre-Protestant society. It's just not really working in this contemporary society that we have, which is why I think, the atheistic white nationalist movement has had a little more success than the NeoReaction.
Well, this gets to an interesting point. This sort of, with NeoReaction and this kind of like pre-Protestant position, there's something just somewhat, well, first of all, it's a kind of crafted narrative. The world they imagine never really existed.
Right.
They kind of invent things, so they'll say, well, the Protestants, but fundamentally there's this weird fetish that the priesthood, there's a basic premise that if you have a priesthood in a church hierarchy, you will not have liberalism, and it gives you protection. Well, it didn't protect France, and it didn't protect Russia. And on the other side, it's completely nonsense. In the modern church, who are the most traditionalist groups? The Amish, the Hutterites, and the Southern Baptists. And none of those groups have an organized hierarchical priesthood. And yet
right. We actually see Catholicism migrating into this liberal direction, especially the likes of Pope Francis. I mean, why is it that the liberal press fawns over this man? It's because the Catholic Church has tried to become more liberal. So obviously, I mean, when you even have a pope, for crying out loud, that is, and a whole hierarchy of bishops and priests, that has not saved them whatsoever.
Well, not only that, it didn't save the Anglicans or the Lutherans either. I mean, the Missouri Synod, I think, is pro-homosexual now. And I know the Anglican Church is. So,
oh, absolutely.
And so that didn't do anything for them. This kind of weird magic, this kind of mythology that a sacerdotal hierarchy protects you from the Enlightenment is baloney, because the worst outbreak of the Enlightenment happened in Russia with the Soviet Union, and that was in the most retrograde medieval society. And in the rest of the hangout that I did on Reactionary Ian, which I was not a part of, there was this kind of sick. Oh, one of the main points I wanted to bring out is that the NeoReaction is fundamentally no different than the left. They're fundamentally Machiavellian. Machiavelli wrote in The Mandrakes, a play in I think it was the 16th century, where he talks about pragmatism versus ethics. There was a childless couple, and a man that wanted to sleep with a married woman. And the childless couple could not have a child because the husband was sterile. And so they reached an agreement based on pragmatism. The man who wanted to sleep with a married woman could, as long as the child would be the heir of the childless couple. And the moral of the play was that pragmatism gets you what you want, and morality does not. And that is exactly the argument that I got from everybody on the Christian auxiliary of the alternative of the NeoReaction, which means you're just like Machiavelli, which means you're just like the Soviets, which means the only difference between Lenin or an anarchist terrorist and the Christian auxiliary of the NeoReaction is the end, not the means.
Exactly. Which actually ought to be considered fundamentally opposed to Catholicism. I believe Voltaire actually responded to the play. In fact, he was very inspired by the play. And he said that the piece mocks the religion which Europe preaches, of which Rome is the center and the throne of which is the papal see. It's very odd then for these people of NeoReaction, supposed Catholics, to actually be so Machiavellian about this.
Well, exactly. I think the letter you're referring to is Les Lettres Adambed, 1769.
Yep.
Exactly. And it says in Wikipedia, the piece that mocks the religion which Europe preaches. But here's the thing. The problem is that Machiavelli, Voltaire, and Dawkins are right in the fact that Christendom was hypocritical and did not at all accept the principles of Christianity.
Exactly.
And in fact, in an article called No Abiding City, David Bentley Hart on First Things argues, and you can read the article yourself online, that Christendom was a betrayal of the gospel. The gospel wasn't about killing people. The gospel was about preaching love and salvation.
Exactly. Well, I mean, you wouldn't really see the likes of, and this brings us back to the Protestant question. That's what I'll call it, the Protestant question. The Mennonites and the Amish are not about to take up the sword, but you'd be hard pressed to find someone in the Catholic Church that wouldn't fight back, or at least in principle oppose it. In other words, violence is okay. Violence is just fine. And so when I think about the Catholic Church, the reason it cracked up was because of its hierarchy, is because of its betrayal of the gospel. When people started pointing that out, it just became irreconcilable. Their mistreatment of the peasantry, and even on the Orthodox side, it just prepped the people over which these individuals ruled for revolutionary spirit. Because, in other words, like I've told you, I said Catholics make the most dangerous atheists. Why? Because they learn to hate Christianity, or at least to hate the hierarchies that are associated with it. And so a lot of people might fault Protestantism with this sort of, this factiousness. And I find it humorous at the same time because, I mean, look, the people in the Dark Enlightenment / NeoReaction, when they talk about Protestantism, the Protestantism of today is definitely nothing akin to the Protestantism as it burst forth in the 16th century. They're very different, very miles apart. But there's something that also can be said is, even whereas the rebellion within the Catholic Church was a question of hierarchy, power and contradiction, within the Protestant movement and how it's spread out, and you have so many denominations, it was really a question of interpretation. not necessarily a question of who holds power.
Well, exactly.
And that's why, and they learned to integrate with the lower classes, and that's why you haven't had these as violent as schisms. Of course, yeah, there's been problems. I mean, man will be man, but you haven't had these violent, terrible, nightmarish schisms.
Well, exactly.
They've just been, and I mean, that can be, and I think that can be when you look, and I was just sort of thinking this out, like, what Catholicism lends itself to revolutionary spirit and violent overthrow, and we see that in Orthodox Russia with the Bolsheviks, and we see that in Catholic France with the Jacobins and the likes of Robespierre. But what do we see within Protestantism? What did the American Revolution wasn't a revolution; it was an act of secession. In other words, the American secession was exactly how the Protestant church secedes from other larger branches. It was a secession. It was withdrawing. I mean, of course, it took England to attack, but that's not the point. It wasn't a revolution. It was a breaking off. And that's what more you see within the Protestant church is a breaking off. Not like this violent revolutionary, I'm going to kill everybody above me mentality.
Well, one of the things that you'll notice if you listen to Reactionary Ian's fourth Hangout that I was involved in is that there's this talk that by the NeoReactionary Christian Auxiliary that they weren't harsh enough. They didn't crack down hard enough. That sounds like Joseph Stalin.
Right.
Communists will say Joseph Stalin didn't crack down hard enough. See, the problem is the crackdowns cause the revolt. If people are not allowed a non-violent resolution process and they feel like they have nothing left to lose, guess what they'll do? They'll revolt and kick you out. The reason why England and the United States and Scandinavia didn't have that was because the central government allowed them to voice their grievances. And the other problem was this: the legitimate grievances of the peasants, due to the corruption of the church, the corruption of the moneylenders, the corruption of the nobility and taxes, was not acknowledged in Russia or France or Spain, which had a revolution.
The people's cry was never heard. It was never acknowledged. It was never remedied.
And so what happened? The
hatred was there to build up.
And the Enlightenment Marxists and Jacobins took the hatred over. In fact, Murray Rothbard, in his one and only dispute with Noam Chomsky, said, "There's nothing in Cambodia about land reform that's Marxist. None of these peasants are Marxist. They just want to own the land they farm."
Exactly.
It's just that the Marxists are the only people that give them that option. And in fact, when we look at the counterinsurgency in Malaysia or in the Philippines in 1954, what do we see? The United States and Great Britain win because they steal the Marxist thunder. They do land reform. They give the peasants their legitimate grievances, and then the Marxists have no more arguments.
Exactly.
But you see, the ancient regime in France or Spain or Russia would never do that because of their retrograde, medieval, backward nature. Yep. And that's why they had the Bolsheviks and the communists and the Jacobins, whereas the Protestant regimes never had that. And there's another reason for that, too. England, the United States, and Scandinavia and Holland had a tradition of limited government and distributed powers. Whereas in France, Spain, and Russia, there was a tradition of absolutism and absolute power. So when Lenin took over, to fill the shoes of the Tsar was a small step.
Exactly. Well, hey, Todd, I'm going to have to get going here shortly. Do you think we could wrap this up?
I'll wrap it up with a quote from David Bentley Hart from his article, No Enduring City. So granting that Thomas and his order were products of their times, still the use of coercion and murder to defend the church cannot be anything other than a betrayal of the gospel, far graver than any mere doctrinal deviation could ever be. This is Thomas Aquinas, Thomas's arguments is at once entirely consistent with the principles of Christendom, yet entirely alien to the principles of Christianity. And that even so powerful an intellect as Thomas could have failed to grasp this, to say the least, is very troubling. Exactly, because the problem is not a problem of right thought per se. I mean, it is. But the fundamental problem is morality.
Yep.
The Voltaire, Dawkins, and Machiavelli do not mock the church for its righteous teachings. They don't mock the church for teaching love your neighbor, give to the poor. They mock the church for acting like secular princes in violation of the doctrine of Christ.
Exactly.
And so
I think go ahead.
No, go ahead. Say your piece.
I was just saying, it's because they actually have a point. Once you fundamentally challenge the moral authority of a ruler, and you successfully do so, and you demonstrate it. In other words, you whenever these people point to the scriptures and say, "Hey, it's plain to see that you shouldn't be waging crusades. You shouldn't be killing people who disagree with you, because it's in direct contradistinction to what Christ said, and you bear his name as a Christian. So what is it that is Christendom? Well, Christendom is a contradiction, and it has no authority. And so once the people get it in their head that Christendom has no authority in virtue of the contradictions to the scripture that supposedly gives it power, then suddenly you see that power vaporize, because it's based on moral authority.
Well, exactly. To quote Ralph Waldo Emerson, for every Stoic was a Stoic, but in Christendom, where was the Christian? Mm-hmm. So I think in closing here, the alternative right is as yet in the alternative right in the United States is a non-issue. It is driven by factionalism, epistemological and moral divisions and differences that seem at the moment irreconcilable. Christians like Matt Parrott and the auxiliary of NeoReaction that seek to ally with such a movement are in fact violating the commandments we find in James of a Christian is not a friend of the world. If you are a friend of the world, you are the enemy of God.
Yeah, that's right.
And is there anything more worldly than Machiavelli's "the ends justify the means," or National Socialism, or paganism? These themselves are the definition of worldliness. And if Christians who seek to identify with such people, whatever legitimate grievances they may or may not have, are in for a rude surprise of disappointment, that they will not win, because we do not win by the ways of man. Christ wins through his own spirit and strength. That weapons are not of flesh and blood. Our weapons are the doctrines of Christ, powerful to tear down strongholds.
That's
so this will be the end of our first podcast, Praise of Folly podcast, episode 1. We hope to have more in the future. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
All right.